Hello. So I am planning on going over A Little Life briefly when I do my recap for the month. But I have been working on this book for like 3 weeks, and I have a lot of thoughts. It's, I think, 800 pages, and I had like 250 quotes highlighted on my Kindle. And so I have a lot of thoughts and reactions to it, and I wanted to kind of talk about it a little more than in a recap. So I guess this is sort of like a review, also just kind of processing some of the thoughts that I had. There are places where I'm probably going to end up getting a little personal in this, because this book definitely had some personally, I don't want to say, I just had a personal connection to this book, definitely. So anyway, without, I guess, going into too much detail, I'll get into that when we get further into the story. Let's talk about what it is and what the book's about and so on. So the book is A Little Life, if you haven't heard of it. It's Hanya Yanagihara. I'm probably not saying that right, and I apologize. So it was a finalist for the National Book Award, the Man Booker Prize, and it won the Kirkus Prize. And the Goodreads summary is a stunning, quote, portrait of the enduring grace of friendship, and that was an NPR quote, about the families we're born into and those that we make for ourselves. A masterful depiction of love in the 21st century. When 4 classmates from a small Massachusetts college moved to New York to make their way, they're broke, adrift, and buoyed only by their friendship and ambition. There's kind, handsome Willem, an aspiring actor, J.B., a quick-witted, sometimes cruel, Brooklyn-born painter seeking entry to the art world, Malcolm, a frustrated architect at a prominent firm, and withdrawn, brilliant, enigmatic Jude, who serves as their center of gravity. Over the decades, their relationships deepen and darken, tinged by addiction, success, and pride. Yet their greatest challenge, each comes to realize, is Jude himself. By midlife, a terrifyingly talented litigator, yet an increasingly broken man. His mind and body scarred by an unspeakable childhood and haunted by what he fears is a degree of trauma that he'll not only be able to overcome, but that will define his life forever. And I definitely feel like this summary isn't totally reflective of what this book is really about. I mean, it is about 4 friends, but really it's the story of Jude, and it's his life, and how his friendships help kind of save him, but also like reiterate some of his own thoughts about himself, and how, some of his friends, how they try to help him, but, everybody has their own challenges, and no one really necessarily knows how to help. And he also is very, he doesn't want to share a lot. He can be frustratingly sort of withdrawn, and so there can be some challenges there, I think, in him connecting to other people, for very good reason, as you come to see throughout the book. But really, it's Jude's story. I mean, it's the story of him, because it reflects back on his childhood. We get a little bit of insight into some of his friends, but really it's about how they affect him, or how they interact with him, rather than it's not necessarily their stories. But yeah, so before I go forward, I do want to say this book has a lot of trigger warnings in most of the summaries, and you really need to heed the warnings on this book. If you're not one who likes books that are dark, who can deal with a lot of very brutal sort of, it's not even graphic descriptions. The descriptions are fairly, they're literary, so they're fairly vague, but it's almost worse because it's really about the emotional description. And so it's so visceral in how you respond to the descriptions of these horrible things happening. And so there's details about addiction, drug use, and then obviously a lot about child abuse, particularly sexual abuse and sex trafficking, and physical abuse. There's domestic violence. There's self-harm, a lot of self-harm. And then there's also, if you have like issues, with like disease and, health issues, because there's some of that too. So really do prepare yourself to heed the warnings. I mean, I love dark books, and like pretty much unless it's like graphic animal abuse, it very rarely phases me. And this like was hard to read in places. Like I had points I had to just put it down and walk away because it was that hard to deal with. Because it's very well written, but it's almost like getting into the mind of someone who's going through what Jude is going through can be very, very hard. So be prepared. Do not go into this with not knowing anything about it. Make sure you're prepared. So I picked a few quotes to kind of that I thought captured some of the things I want to talk about with this book. And the first was, "Life is so sad," he would think in those moments. "It's so sad, and yet we all do it. We all cling to it. We all search for something to give us solace." And I feel like this is a huge part of this book, is it's about trying to find connection in a world that you're not sure there is a connection. I mean, that, in reality, life isn't like it is in movies. It's not like it is in books. It can be hard. And sometimes, it can constantly be hard, and, things don't work out. And in a lot of ways, I mean, Jude's life is good. I mean, he, a lot of things do go his way. But, I think when you deal with trauma, and especially, I think one of the things that really stood out to me in this book, is that it's not just that Jude has experienced trauma, it's just he experienced it as a child. And I think childhood trauma is, and I don't know, maybe I'm just speaking from, personal experience too, but, and I mean, by no means was my childhood like Jude's, I mean, his is appalling, what he went through. But I do think, if you've experienced trauma as a child, it's really hard, because that's such a formative point in your life. It's hard to sort of see the world differently. And at points, like when Jude is older, he's like, why did these 15 years of my life shape me so much? Here I am in my 40s, and, it was only a small portion of my life. It was a third of my life. So why is it having so much impact? Why does it kind of color everything? And I think that's one of the things about childhood trauma is, like, no matter how well things go, no matter what you learn otherwise, no matter what kind of relationships you learn otherwise, you can never get that out of your head, that, I mean, those challenges that you had as a child. And, it shapes how you kind of try to connect to people, how you see people, whether you can trust anyone. And it's hard. It's damage that, some people do overcome. And I read some reviews and people were like, I don't want to be told that, like, you can't overcome. And yeah, I mean, some people do and some people don't. And I think for every book that's like hopeful and that gives you like, yeah, you can overcome all this tragedy. I do think it's important. There's also stories that are like, what? Sometimes you can't. And how do you survive anyway? And, at what point is survival? Like, what are you surviving for? And so I think we see that a lot in, like, why these friendships are so important to Jude, because they are what gives him that sense of solace in these moments. And he does have really good friends, and I admit I'm a little jealous, like I've never had the kind of connections that he's had. And so I think, like, one of the things that was so hard about this book is, I connected to it in a way I don't think I've ever connected to a book. Maybe Catcher in the Rye when I was 12 and I was, struggling to feel like I was never going to fit in. And then I read Catcher in the Rye and was like, oh, wow, there's somebody else who thinks like me. Maybe I'm not a weirdo, or, maybe there are people out there like me. And that was kind of life-saving. And I know I talked about this at one point in an earlier video. And I know I've talked a lot about, like, I did a whole thing on mental health. But I think that's the thing is like, I connected to it in a way that I was like, wow, like in some ways I felt like this author was just taking all of these thoughts I'd had and all these feelings and like things I really wanted to articulate, and just putting them on the page in front of me. And I just like kind of want to take it and give it to certain people in my life and be like, please, like, this is what I wanted to try to say. And, I don't know, maybe I just don't think, I don't have the people that Jude had in his life. So, yeah. So the next quote I really liked was, every time he hoped things would be different. Every time he told himself it would be. The sorrow he felt when he realized that even Willem couldn't save him, that he was irredeemable, that this experience was forever ruined for him, was one of the greatest of his life. And this is one of the more tragic parts of the book. And I'm not going to go into like the context because I think it's a little spoilery, but really it's just about, hanging on to hope despite all of this trauma and all of this tragedy, and he hangs on and he tries so hard to make it be different, but he can't. And he sees himself as broken and irredeemable, and like no matter what anyone tells him, no matter what experiences he has, he can't get over that. And it's frustrating. I honestly can see how frustrating it is, because there's chapters from other characters' perspective and you're like, oh, just be okay. And I can see why it's really hard to be around people with PTSD and with severe depression and anxiety and these kind of issues. And I understand, but at the same time, as somebody who connects to Jude, it's not like you're trying. It's not like you're not trying. You want to not feel like this, but it's just what you feel. And there's one section in the book called The Happy Years, and I mean, the whole book is very sad. So it is sad as well as being happy in that section. But I think what's strange is there's, I think, a level of nuance that maybe you need to either have experienced trauma, have, some mental health issues in your own life, be around people like Jude maybe, to really pick up on some of those nuances, because it isn't just sad. It's sad, but there's like a certain beauty in the sadness, because there are moments of beauty and there are moments of joy, and he has those. And, he doesn't throw it all away. It's not like he's constantly miserable. He tries, and has very good moments. But I mean, unfortunately, when it comes to trauma, like I said, especially childhood trauma, and when you have some of these, some of it's also like, a mental health thing, you can't escape it. I mean, it's just there, and there's only so much you can do. And so the last quote that I really liked was, he had tried. All his life he had tried. He had tried to be someone different. He had tried to be someone better. He had tried to make himself clean. But it hadn't worked. Once he had decided, he was fascinated by his own hopefulness, by how he could have saved himself years of sorrow by just ending it. He could have been his own savior. No law said he had to keep on living. His life was still his own to do with what he pleased. How had he not realized this in all these years? The choice now seemed obvious. The only question was why it had taken him so long. And so this is, again, this is what's challenging, is there's a lot of description like this about his rational thinking into why he should commit suicide. And that can be hard on people, especially if if you've been on the other side of it. But I think it's also a really interesting conversation, because, a lot of people are really strong advocates for, assisted suicide with terminal physical illnesses. But then what about people who have like such strong trauma and such strong mental illnesses? Like, at some point, is there a time when you can say, like, this person has made a rational decision and maybe it is okay? And, again, I'm not trying to suggest that you should go and, like, anyone should go commit suicide or anything like that. but I'm just saying it's also like a very brutally realistic look at, you know, how do you keep going? You know, at what point, like, are you like, okay, there's, you know, what is there? What are you holding on to? And, you know, again, in Jude's case, I think he has a lot to live for. But it's definitely, it puts you in the mind of someone who's very damaged. And, you know, like I said, I connected to this in a way that I had to sort of sometimes like stop reading for periods of time because it was a little too much. So to go into like what I liked, I thought it was beautifully written. I thought the characters were very compelling, and I thought the depiction of PTSD was extremely realistic. I very strongly connected to it. What I disliked is it was difficult to read, and it was an emotional roller coaster. I mean, it's 100% a 5-star read. Like I said, I think this is the first book after like Catcher in the Rye when I was a teenager that I connected to in this kind of way. I mean, it's so hard for me to speak about this book because it's so much like just thoughts I've had and feelings I've had, and you know, it was very hit very close for a lot of the pieces, and it was just very difficult. But it was also beautiful and kind of nice for a period to, like, I don't want to say escape because I don't read to escape, and I mean it's definitely not an escape here, but to kind of feel that connection that I think, you know, I've always been kind of looking for in my life, and to see that on the page, you know, it was very comforting, even though it was hard to read, so if that makes any sense. So anyway, I loved this book. Really recommend it. I'll talk about it more in the recap. I know that was a little rambly, but I don't know, like, I don't think I can do this book justice. But it was beautiful, and it meant a lot to me. So that's my thoughts on the book, and I will do a recap later. Bye.